It's interesting. I'm thinking of a company I did some work for. I did work for one department of it, one division of it. And part of their culture was to talk about their culture, but which was great, except folks in the organization got a little bit, jaded, like, oh yeah, we're talking about the culture again. But here are all these things we never talk about, the elephants in the room.
This is the Brandon Smith Show, and the entire purpose of the show is one singular thing, and that's to help you live a life that much more free from dysfunction. So our topic today is a topic that I have taken on in other shows in various different angles because it's a passionate topic of mine, and we're going to talk about culture. We're going to talk about how do you not only determine what your culture is and assess the culture, but also how do you start to move forward to create the right culture, either for your organization or your team. And so to help us on this journey, I have an amazing guest, Claudette Rowley. Claudette, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Brandon. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I am really excited to have you on. So to give listeners a little bit of background, you are the founder of Cultural Brilliance, also the name of your book. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to get to talk a little bit about that book and some of your perspectives on this. And I had the opportunity and unique experience of being on your podcast.
Yeah.
So this is nice to kind of share this space with each other. I really am a passionate believer in culture and really admire all the good work that you do.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, it was great to have you on the show, and it is really fun to do this, to have two chances to talk about a topic we're both so passionate about, culture.
I know.
Culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. So before we jump into this topic and even talk a little about the book that's come out, I'd love for you to just share a little bit with my listeners. What are some of the things that you do in the world? How does this show up for you, and how do you kind of take this idea of culture and kind of help people and companies kind of move forward with it?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I've had my company for 19 and a half years, and I've almost always been working with culture or coaching leaders, and in the last few years, I started to really explicitly do cultural change, cultural transformation, cultural design work. So that's really how I take it out into the world in a very explicit way, where I'm working with like you do often as well. I know working with organizations and helping them really understand how their culture operates, how it's serving them, how it's holding them back, and then what we can do to help move them and move all the people in the organization forward in a way that's really supportive to the business mission and to the folks who work there.
This is something that you and I don't think we've spoken about recently. I'd love your thoughts on this. How have you seen that change over 19 years? Like when people think about what culture means to them today, and what are where they need the most help, how's that changed and evolved?
I think 19 years ago in the spaces I was in, people were, even up until I would say 5 to 10 years ago, people didn't talk a lot about culture. I mean, there are folks out in the world doing culture consulting and working on culture, but I didn't hear about it. I didn't see all the books that we now see about it, right? I probably wouldn't have written a book about it 10 years ago because I would have thought, who would read it? Because it was just a different space,
Yeah.
Or I would have had different expectations for the book. But I'm in the Boston area, and in New England, one of the things I've really noticed historically has been that people would say, don't talk about culture. I mean, literally, other consultants would say to me, don't talk about culture with clients. They'll never hire you. They'll never hire you. You have to talk about productivity, communication, leadership, something else entirely.
I've heard the same thing.
And kind of get into culture through the back door. So what I see, the big thing I see changed is that we can talk about it more explicitly now. We can talk about it more openly. The thing that I think is still the same is I work with a lot of companies that are having issues, and it's never occurred to them that it's about their culture, right? It just the dots haven't connected that they even think, wow, could this be a cultural issue? They're still back at as productivity, or we need new employees, or whatever the case may be.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a nice segue then into the book, because you said 10 years ago you might not have never have written the book, and now we've got this book. So tell me a little bit about what prompted you to write it. What was kind of that spark for you that said, gosh, I need to kind of bring this to life?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wrote the book because I 3 or 4 years ago came up with a set of ideas that make up the book Cultural Brilliance. And I wanted to put them out into the world. I was really excited to share these ideas and perspectives, the system I put together. So the book, once I started to get the ideas, it was always clear to me that I needed to eventually put it in a book, and which is what I did. And I wrote a book about a decade ago more for individuals And so I'd been through the book writing experience once. So that helps because you kind of know how to do it once you've done it. Once you've done it once, you understand the rhythm and mechanics of it. So I knew it was something that I could do, and it was something I really wanted to put out into the world.
So the title of the book is Cultural Brilliance, and I'm really fascinated by the word brilliance. So what makes a culture brilliant? How do we know that we were either in one or we're not in one?
I think of the brilliance in a couple of different ways, and I talk about it in the book. One is, I think of brilliance as potential, that a lot of organizations, and I'm sure you see this all the time too, leave so much potential on the table in the form of their culture, right? By not having a culture that's optimal for them, or by not addressing chronic, as you said, dysfunctional issues in the culture. So I think about it as potential. And then when brilliant culture, I think is certainly I think of culture like a fingerprint, right? There are no two alike. So brilliance is going to look different in different organizations. But I think some of the bedrocks and foundational pieces are that there's a high level of trust and psychological safety in the culture, so people feel safe to share their ideas, to be creative, to make mistakes, to learn those kinds of things. I don't know how you can have a great culture without that kind of trust in place. Also, that there's the other thing that I see in brilliant culture is that there's a degree of what I call strategic problem solving, that we're not, because we can speak openly, we're not going to allow problems to recur in this chronic way that a lot of organizations do. We're actually going to get in there and solve them in a strategic way so that we can actually move on to something else, right, in the organizational growth, success, development. And another aspect of it is that there's, the idea of feedback, right, that people are growing themselves, they're developing themselves, or helping to develop each other. And that becomes part of it, that we're not only here to get a job done, we're also here to continuously evolve in some way, whatever that looks like in that organization.
I love that picture you painted. It's this picture of people wanting to grow, people wanting to learn, people feeling free to kind of bring their full self to the environment. And while we all are in firefighter mode to a certain degree, for a large majority of our working days, it's a picture of people trying to put some time aside to be proactive, to address root causes of issues rather than just symptoms. So I want to start with your first one around trust and psychological safety.
Yeah.
Because some of our listeners are going to be leaders of organizations. Some listeners are going to be leaders of teams. How can you create trust or psychological safety? What have you seen as some techniques that people can use that are effective?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of truth telling, right? And so creating an environment, whether it's your team or your team culture or your organizational culture, whatever you're looking at. And how can we create a cultural safety zone, a place where we can be open and honest to talk, even if it doesn't feel safe initially, or we feel a little bit vulnerable, right? Or we feel like we're taking a risk. But we create parameters around that conversation, right? Here are our guidelines, here are our ground rules, quote unquote, about how we're going to interact with each other, how we're going to respect each other, how we're going to hear each other, listen to each other, so that people really can start telling the truth about their own experiences. And I talk about this as truth with a small t, right? Because my truth is not going to be somebody else's truth necessarily, because we've had different experiences that we filter through our own lenses, our own brains. But how can we create an environment where we can talk about what's actually going on? Because I find that not only builds trust, but allows us to then address, as you said, root causes and reality. There's often a reality in teams and organizations that gets skipped, right? We just never talk about what's actually going on.
So it sounds like the leader needs to create that context first and set that up.
I think the leader has to create the context, right? Because they're role modeling and they need to have that behavior. And then I'm a big fan and believer of that, the symbiotic relationship between the leader and the followers, or the leader and the employees, the entire group. So if I'm on a team and the leader's role modeling this, how am I choosing to respond? How I'm choosing to respond also matters, right? I don't believe it's all entirely on the leader, but they need to lead that charge, and everyone else needs to come along and participate. I think it's both.
Yeah. So if I put it in my own words, you tell me if this feels right to you.
Okay.
It's like the leader is maybe responsible for setting up the invitation, and it's the followers responsible for accepting it.
Yeah, I like that.
Is that fit?
Exactly.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, I come up with a good one, Claudette. That might be my one for the show today. I don't know.
Yeah.
So let's stay on this idea of leader a little bit longer. What else
Okay.
can she or he do to move the needle forward and make the culture feel and become more brilliant than maybe it is
Yeah.
today?
I Listening. I think listening is huge, and I know it's so basic, right? The need to listen, and we know a lot of times anybody, nor whether they're a leader or not, but sometimes leaders have a hard time listening to things they don't want to hear. And I've seen this in action many, many
Oh,
times. Like they're happy to listen to things they wanted to hear or they were hoping to hear, but those things that were are really difficult to hear because maybe they're simply quite painful. They're painful to hear. The leader feels like maybe they've failed, makes them feel vulnerable. Maybe the person delivering the message is someone the leader actually doesn't really like very much, right? And probably doesn't show that, but in terms of like, oh, it's so and so again, right? She always has a complaint. There's always something, right? And so it's hard to hear so and so's message, even if she might have a point. So that ability to listen to everything, which doesn't mean you need to act on everything, right? You have to discern it, but listen to everything and take it in as information and really start noticing, are there patterns to the information? If you stood as a leader outside your own culture or your team culture and you really watched and tried to drop your own biases and filters as much as we humanly can and just said, if I was a detective and I just stood back and really watched this situation and observed what would I notice about what's happening and how people behave and interact? I mean, that's another, those, that the act of observation, the act of listening are huge in trying to understand culture.
and hear that one is very related to the first in some
Yeah,
ways because that's part
definitely.
of that honesty,
Hmm.
candor, vulnerability, being able to just really create that environment.
Yeah, that if I know I can go to the leader of my organization and say anything as long as it's respectful and professional, and I'm going to get heard, that completely changes the level of trust I have in that person and in the
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah. And it feels like a safe environment. I can deliver
Yeah.
bad news and it's going to get heard and acknowledged, and I'm not going to get shot for doing it
Right. Or ignored,
or
right?
ignored. Yeah.
Right. Or
Which,
just told something and then nothing ever happens. Right.
yeah. Which may be even worse than being shot because it's more of a slow death. I totally get it.
Yeah. In some ways it is, I think.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I totally get it.
Yeah.
Anything else as we stay on the topic of leader before we kind of pivot off it? Anything else that she or he could be doing to kind of help move the culture forward?
Yeah. Another key thing that comes to mind is really tuning into the emotional culture, which I think the idea of emotional culture is, I'm hearing about it more, right, in books and articles, people talking about it. And I didn't write about it specifically in my book, but it's such a key point around noticing what is the emotional undercurrent running through your culture, right? Is it tense? Is it relaxed? Is it urgent? Is it fun? Is it high energy, low energy, whatever? And I notice some leaders intuitively do that with probably not even realizing they do it. And other leaders, it doesn't come that as easily or naturally to them, which doesn't mean they can't learn it. So they tend to disregard it. They don't really tune in to the fact that people are human and having emotions all day long. And that might be why, the leader may present this great new idea and this new strategic plan, just to have an example, and doesn't really get why everyone's, like, oh my, there's no energy around it. They have no enthusiasm. They're not responsive. And the leader's scratching his or her head. And someone comes in and says, did you notice how there was tremendous tension in the room when you started to unveil that plan? Perhaps we should find out why everyone was so tense. There's
Yeah,
something going on in the emotional undercurrent.
that's beautiful. I love that. And we're about to take a break, but it made me think as you were talking the role too that the leader plays on generating that, whether conscious of it or not.
Right.
So to sidestep a little bit, I read a really fascinating article about a week ago. Came out of some research that was being done at Yale, and they
Mm-hmm.
studied kids with anxiety, and they studied
Yeah.
all different ways of treating kids with anxiety, and they
Mm-hmm.
found the best way to help kids with anxiety overcome anxiety was to not treat them, treat the parents.
Oh, that makes so much
Where they
sense.
treat the parents
Absolutely.
and give them coping skills for dealing with anxiety, the anxiety in the household drops because the
Exactly.
parents are part of the reason why that's happening in that culture. Is it's
Yeah.
starting from the top and it's creating this kind of cloud and environment. So they said treat the parents and the kids' anxiety goes away. Isn't that
Makes so
fascinating?
much sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For you and I, it's like, of course, that makes perfect sense. We see the role of the leader and how they contribute to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's take a break, and we come back from break. We're going to continue on this path of culture because I've got a few more questions I want to ask you about your book.
Great.
Okay. All right. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Here's your coaching minute for the week, presented to you by the Leadership Foundry. Dysfunction in the workplace, it's a pervasive problem. Here's a simple tip to eliminate dysfunction, both in your team, but even in the environments around you. Clarify your team members' roles, goals, and responsibilities. So just spend some time thinking about, does all of my team know? Does each of them know what their role is, what the goals are of the team, and their responsibilities? If the answer is yes, you right there eliminate 50% of all the dysfunction that could come up in your team. If the answer is no, think about how you could do that better. When we don't do that, one of two things happens. Either people overlap work and they step on each other's toes, or you have one person carrying much bigger load while a couple other people are hanging out not doing near as much work. It's one of the big problems in the nonprofit world is a lack of clarity around roles, goals, and responsibilities. So focus on those three things, and I promise you, not only will you eliminate dysfunction, it's going to make your workplace that much more enjoyable. Welcome back from break. Of course, this is the Brandon Smith Show. And right before the break, we were talking about culture. And we were talking about how to create brilliant cultures. And we were talking about the role of leaders in creating those brilliant cultures. So, Claudette, I'm going to turn the coin to the other side a little bit. We're going to talk about warning signs that your culture is in not good shape, whatever that means. But we've all felt that. Even if we haven't been able to put our finger on it. We've all been in environments before, points in our career, where we said, this is not good. There's a culture here, but it's not definitely the one that I would want to be part of, or maybe even the right one for us. So what are some warning signs that we need to be on the lookout for?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And I think it's so important to know the warning signs, because often when the warning signs are happening, organizations don't necessarily think, gosh, could this be a cultural issue, right? They don't look at that root cause. You know, one of the things is that your culture makes people leave, right? There's a revolving door of people leaving. And then, of course, you know, new folks getting hired and then they leave, right? And so and it's interesting, I often find this, like the emperor doesn't have clothes on kind of situation where everyone's like, I don't know why people are leaving. And I said, well, why don't we ask the folks who work for the company and find out why other people are leaving, right? Because they'll actually know, and I'm sure they can tell us. So you have a lot of turnover. You know, another one, and this is talked about quite a bit now, but you tolerate bullying behavior. You know, there's never a reason to tolerate bullies in your workplace. To me, it means that your culture is fine with disrespecting people, is fine with treating people badly, and that there's never a reason. And the reasons I hear are, oh, well, this person's a rainmaker. Our big number one customer loves her, right? She's amazing. She is so brilliant. It doesn't matter, because there's a lot of research out there that actually shows, will detail out how much money your company's actually losing when you keep a bullying behavior. So that's a huge red flag for me. A couple others are that people get punished. We alluded to this a little earlier, right? Shooting the messenger, like people get punished for telling the truth. And I think a lesser form of that is the culture in which there's a lot of blaming, there's a lot of finger pointing. And that's not a one-time thing. It's, it's repeated. It's part of the culture that we just we blame each other and we finger point as a way to avoid taking responsibility, or because that's what our organization's always done. And we worked with a company recently who they've shifted that, but that was a huge foundation of their culture, is they just blame each other and point fingers, and then of course nothing would get done, right? Because they were too busy doing that. Yeah. Takes a lot of energy to operate in cultural dysfunction. The last one I want to mention is...
that's a great line, by the way. I want to go back to that line. It takes a lot of energy to operate in cultural dysfunction.
Oh, it does. Just like in family dysfunction, right? It takes a lot of effort to operate in that kind of dysfunction. And what's nice now is there's been so much, as I know, so much research in trust and in culture and all those topics related to it, that we now know we can actually put numbers to how much it costs, right, to exist in cultural dysfunction. It's a distraction, but it also costs a lot of money. Even taking the high turnover example, right? My gosh, how much money it costs to find new people, hire new people, train new people, et cetera. So that's huge. But I think one that often gets overlooked that I always like to mention is, in terms of a cultural warning sign, is your leader or leadership team ask people for data and never do anything with it. And I think it's a very sly or sometimes slick way to not actually have a truth telling conversation with someone that sounds like this. We know you think this idea is really good, and for these reasons, we are not going to act on this, right? Just tell them that person the truth. Don't keep asking them for more data. Because what happens is folks start to disengage and get incredibly frustrated when they're repeatedly asked for information and to put metrics together, put data together that nobody ever does anything with.
Yeah. Wow. I would not want to work in an environment that had any of those. And I'm sure
No,
we've seen
no,
environments that have more than one of those. And we
definitely.
can see how they all play together. You've got bullies, and then you
They
have high
do.
turnover. And so,
Yeah.
and a lot of what you mentioned there was a lot of small micro things that,
Hmm.
if left unchecked, cause bigger
Right.
issues.
It caught the company I was mentioning with the blaming and finger pointing. What I found there is no one was taking ownership of anything. No one wanted to actually make decisions because they didn't want to get blamed. That's how far it had gone.
Yeah.
So yeah, you could, like you said, it's micro, right? It's these small things that over time are they become so cumulative. They become part of the culture, right? Part of the pattern.
Yeah. So I think for everyone listening, whether you sit on top of an organization or a team,
Hmm.
to go back and rehear what you just said and make sure you have plans or policies or approaches in place to shut any of those things down when they occur. I think that's beautiful and brilliant.
Mm.
So I do have another question I want to ask you,
Hmm.
slightly around the same vein of culture that's not working, but slightly different, a more subtler version of this. So,
Hmm.
so is it possible that the culture that you've had over years, maybe decades,
Hmm.
you just outgrow it? It's no longer working for you. The market's moved, and you're like,
Yeah.
wow, we can't keep doing stuff like this. We
Hmm.
gotta change.
Hmm.
Is that
Yeah, I've absolutely seen that, and I think as we know, when ideally cultures are evolving, right, with the organization, hopefully intentionally in the direction they want them to go. But I have seen examples, yeah, as you said, where the company really worked hard to keep a certain culture, and there might have been really positive facets to it. That might have been a positive thing at one point, but then, as you said, they outgrow it, right? Their sales volume increases. That's a great thing, but maybe it shifts them into a tailspin because they don't have a way to handle it.
mm,
Or maybe it was a very casual, like the classic example of the startup, right? We're casual, we're this, we're 20 people, we have we all grab a beer on Friday after work, but that may not work when you have 100 to 200 people. And so you need more systems and processes in place. You need a little more structure, as we all know, as a startup moves forward. But yeah, when we try to keep, and I actually was at a culture conference a couple of years ago as an attendee, and it was fascinating to me. There was a panel, and some people, audience members, kept asking folks on the panel who were all high up in organizations, CEOs, chief people officers, those kind of titles. How do we keep our culture? And someone finally said, and I was so glad she did. She was a founder of a really successful startup. She said, "Your culture should evolve. You should not keep it. You know, it needs to change as your business grows, right?" And I was so grateful that she said that because there were other folks on the panel that were advising how to keep your culture. And I was just thinking, no, no, you have to let it grow, right?
so I think that we're onto something really important that people don't always consider. They tend to
Hmm.
do this big seminal event, leadership, quote unquote, leadership goes off
Right.
to an offsite. They come back with a list of values and a purpose statement or
Oh,
whatever it
yeah.
is. They say, here's our culture. Stick it in
Hmm.
behind the plexiglass wall, goes on over, and then they just walk away, as if like it's a one time event, and now we're just that's it.
Yeah.
How, so I'm really curious if you have a thought on this. How often should a leader evaluate her or his culture? How often should they be going back to that plexiglass and taking it
Hmm.
down and saying, is this still who we need to be in order to
Yeah.
achieve what we need to achieve?
Hmm. That's such an interesting question. And, it seems like regularly, you know what I mean? That it's an annual and it's interest an annual event or whatever makes sense in the rhythm of, I would say, the rhythm of your culture and industry, right? But that, especially if you've done a cultural or transform part of your culture, you did assessment work, you're really intentional about upgrading some things, and then, like you said, then you leave it and never check back. It's interesting. I'm thinking of a company I did some work for. I did work for one department of it, one division of it, and they part of their culture was to talk about their culture, but which was great, except folks in the organization got a little bit, jaded, like, oh yeah, we're talking about the culture again. But here are all these things we never talk about, the elephants in the room. And I learned a lot from hearing the employees of this company have that conversation. And I thought, yeah, if you're going to talk regularly, look back at your culture, you need to be incredibly authentic about it and really make it, that level of truth telling part of how you look, and whether it's once a year, once every 5 years, once, whatever makes sense for you, that you're going back and looking at it with really fresh eyes, not just, oh, it's our annual, cultural review. Let's check those boxes. It could get very stale over time.
So
how do you put fresh eyes?
I had this aha, and it ties into what your comment about fresh eyes. I had this aha as you were talking, and I was watching you on the monitor, and I'm thinking about myself. And every year, I always get pinged from my optometrist to go in for my eye exam. And I'm really good about getting my physical, my regular full health physical, but I typically don't do my eye exam as much as I should. I should do it every year because it's the lenses I look through.
Exactly.
And our culture is the lenses we look through. And we really should be doing that eye exam, our lenses, every single year because our eyesight might have changed. And we might not be seeing some things or seeing things differently.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that. Right. So now it's common sense, right? As you're putting it, it's common sense. Of course, you'd want to get your eyes checked culturally once a year.
Yeah. So make sure, because, they just gave me transition lenses, so I can see the stuff up close and the stuff far away. And if I don't have that, things are going to not look, I'm going to think things are fine. They may not actually be fine.
Right.
And culture's the same way. So, okay. I said I had one good idea. I ended up with two this show. That never happens.
Oh my gosh.
You inspired me. So Claudette, we're nearing the end of the show. I ask all my guests this question. What is a life hack you have for us to help us live our lives more free from dysfunction, whether it's personal or professional?
Yeah, and this is something I use throughout my personal life and my professional life, and it's a theme that's come up in our show, but it has to do with truth telling. So, and that could be telling the truth to someone else, telling my truth, but also I think more importantly, telling the truth to myself about how I feel about a situation, a person, a work environment, whatever the case may be. And I find that when I do that, everything gets much easier, right? May not be always simple, but it's easier in the sense of like, okay, well, now that I've told myself the truth about this situation, I now know I need to have a conversation with so-and-so, right? And move forward that way. So I find that is my big life hack.
Yeah, sticking with this idea of brilliance, that's brilliant. I love this idea of not only telling the truth to others, but to yourself. And maybe even start with yourself first.
Yeah.
And because that could then prompt action. Well, okay, I've said it out loud to myself. Now I need to go do something with it.
Right, exactly.
That's great. Right. Okay, so this was absolutely amazing. You're absolutely amazing. If people want to learn more about you or even purchase a copy of your book, which I highly recommend, where can they go?
Oh, thanks. So my website is culturalbrilliance.com. You can find the book on there. Lots of information about my company and what I do. And then the book is also on Amazon.com for those who go to the Amazon track. Okay, so they can get Amazon, they can get off your site, and if they want to learn more about you or think about engaging you, they can also go to your site for that too. Absolutely, the site and LinkedIn as well. So go to either and you'll find out a lot about my services. I have some great resources on the website. I have my own radio show, as we talked about. Brandon was on it. So radio show is archived there too. Oh, fantastic. Claudette, thank you. Amazing. Thanks so much, Brandon. Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. And thank you for listening and watching. Of course, catch a new show every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. where we have a new show taking on these topics of helping to live our lives more free from dysfunction. And you can listen on iTunes if you're not already, or you can watch it on Facebook Live if you're not already. And please go to my website, theworkplacetherapist.com, for more resources for you. And if you've enjoyed the show, which I certainly hope you have, please rate, review, and subscribe. That's how others find it, and we can spread the good news. So until the next time our paths cross, have a great week and an awesome life.